marginalized, and disrespected individuals all over the world find ways to rebel against economic and political discrimination. But as the leaders of their communities, women in particular have to find ways to survive while also taking care of themselves, their families, and their community. In a new book, Beyond Racial Capitalism, Co-operatives in the African Diaspora, Professors Caroline Shenaz Hossein, Sharon D. Wright Austin, and Kevin Edmonds have assembled a group of women to write about the barriers they encounter, their participation in the Black social economy, and the ways they empower themselves by creating member-owned institutions and cooperating with the others in their community. The authors refer to the racial capitalism framework because the work of these women in the African diaspora is in direct rebellion against exploitative capitalist systems in their countries. Their ultimate goal is to amass wealth and political power, but also to demand respect and to thrive. Published by the prestigious Oxford University Press, this book is a must-read for individuals interested in the politicized actions of women in cities in Brazil, Canada, Ireland, the Caribbean, and the United States.
Yeah. Hello, everyone. Yes. Good afternoon. Good to see you here. My name is Rafael Groman. I am assistant professor of media studies at the University of Toronto, Scarborough, graduate cross appointment at Faculty of Information. This is DigiLabor YouTube channel. It's based at the University of Toronto. I will start this book talk on Beyond Racial Capitalism, Co-operative in the African Diaspora with a land acknowledgement. And I would like to acknowledge the land on which both the University of Toronto and I work and operate. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of Huron-Wendat, Seneca, and the Mississauga of the Credit River. And today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and I'm grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land and acknowledging that this place is still a colonizing place in both material and symbolic ways. And just to start this conversation with this important acknowledgement. And today we will see and so interesting conversation on the book called Beyond Racial Capitalism, Co-operatives in the African Diaspora, published by Oxford University Press. And I have here with me amazing people with collaborated with this book. Professor Caroline Hossein, who is Associate Professor of Global Development at the University of Toronto, Scarborough. Sharon Wright Austin, Professor of Political Science at the University of Florida. Kevin Edmonds, Assistant Professor of Caribbean Studies at the University of Toronto. Caroline, Sharon, and Kevin edited this book together. And there are two authors. One is joining us, Silvane Silva from Brazil, also my country, and Salewa Olawoye. Salewa is assistant professor in the Business and Society program in the Department of Social Science at York University, Toronto. So welcome to this conversation. I will invite all the audience to ask your questions, to comment through the chat. What are your impressions about the talks? We really like provoking questions too. And so we will be inspired. For those who don't know, I am particularly interested on cooperatives and technology from intersectional lens. So I'm looking forward to learn with you in through this book. So I would like to invite Professor Caroline Hossein and Professor Sharon Austin to introduce this book. What are your main goals when you produce this book? Good afternoon for you both. Good. Thank you
Thank
for
you.
having me.
Thank you.
So Sharon, do you want to start?
I thought you can start if you want.
Okay, sure. So I'd like to thank you there, Professor Groman, for inviting all of us to speak about a book that has meant a lot to all of us. It has been a challenge to get this book out into the world, not because of the diligence of the authors, but finding a place that was brave enough to really take on the risk to publish it. Because we're really trying to go towards hopeful sort of solutions that are really viable in sort of managing and mitigating the harmful effects of racial capitalism. My name is Caroline Shenaz Hossein. I am also, besides being a professor at the University of Toronto, I'm the co-founder of the DICE Collective, and I'm proud to say that I'm here with Sharon Austin, a professor at the University of Florida, who's also a DICE member. And when Dr. Silvane Silva joins us, she's also a member of the DICE Collective. It's a feminist, political, economic collective where we're thinking about alternative solutions. Please find us on Africana Economics. I'll drop the link later. So thank you for having us today, Professor Groman. This book is about understanding membership institutions, primarily in the informal. And there are three things that I think this book is very helpful in underlining. I'm getting a lot of feedback on this. Yep. There are three things. One is that the book is unapologetic for its informality. We speak about something called purposefully informal and how people choose and respect the value of informal institutions. So that runs across the 9 different case studies. Sharon will speak to where those cases are and who some of the people are leading them. The next one is going beyond racial capitalism. We are no longer trying to let the harms define who we are as people of African descent, but we're also trying to showcase a way forward for all of humanity when we start thinking about how we do business more humanely and through cooperative and collective decision making. Where do we find, as Bell Hooks spoke about, this radical love or radical care, the camaraderie that it takes for us to rage up and build something new? And finally, what does Blackness look like in the diaspora? And right now, what you'll see is that we're working with cooperative experiences, both in quote unquote developed country context, as well as in the global South. And to understand that these cooperative experiences are very contextualized with inside countries and across countries. And that it's people of African descent that are choosing these membership institutions as a way to manage exclusion, as a way to manage the effects of racial capitalism, but also as a way to extend joy, pleasure, and livelihood making. I just wanted to end with something by the foreword in this book has been really powerful. It was done by Dr. Tiffany Willoughby Herard. She is a professor at University of California, Irvine, and she was at the time the president of NCOPS, the National Conference for Black Political Scientists. In her foreword, under the section called Antique Legacies and Cultural Resources, she says this about the editors. The editors trace cultural resources to African antiquity and to notions of exchange and trade as enriching participants in interactions instead of using usury, trickery, or fraud to hoard value while reducing other people's labor, skills, insights, beliefs, or products to less than nothing. This work produces equitable work in the economy and a social economy that is distinctive, that is resilient to global world crises, and strives for ethical and moral higher ground through disavowing dispossession, theft, enslavement, exploitation, extortion, and stealing the livelihoods of the poor to benefit the rich and protected. Quote. So that, I think, is a really good sort of idea of where and what the intention of writing about these cooperative economies comes from. I'm going to pass it over to Professor Austin so that she can also fill in the gaps of my introduction. Thanks.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Hossein. I'll be brief. First of all, I want to define for our listeners who may not be familiar with the concept of solidarity economics, to define what that means and what we're writing about in the book. It's an edited book that Professor Hossein and also Professor Edmonds and I co-edited together. And solidarity economics is what we're talking about in the book. And that's when people work in solidarity with each other and profit financially in communities where they're deprived of substantial political and economic resources. But it's about more than just people making money. People around the world, especially women around the world, is our focus, engage in these political economy strategies because of the barriers associated with racial capitalism in various cities. And the late Professor Cedric Robinson wrote extensively about racial capitalism, especially in his 1983 book, Black Marxism, The Making of the Black Radical Tradition. And what we argue is that the work in each of the case studies in the chapters is an example of the Black radical tradition, is when people of color come together and find ways to fight against economic discrimination, political discrimination, and other forms of discrimination. Racial capitalism is defined as the economic profit that whites receive from exploiting the labor of Blacks and other people of color. So we're writing about these as examples of people rebelling against the racial capitalism that they have to deal with. The book consists of 10 chapters, and Professor Hossein just mentioned the foreword by Professor Tiffany Willoughby Herrard of the University of California, Irvine. And also there's an afterword by Esteban Kelly. And in each of the 10 chapters, we talk about different cases from Canada, from the United States. You'll hear about the experiences of Nigerian immigrants countering racial capitalism in North America. We write about American cities like New York City, Washington, D.C. We write about the experiences of Mexican immigrants in New Jersey and also in Staten Island, New York. We write and you'll hear about the Caribbean and Professor Edmonds' research. And you'll also hear about Brazil today as well. And you'll also hear about Black Irish women. This was fascinating to me when I read the book, because I had no idea about Nigerian women in Dublin, Ireland, and Nigerian and African women working in different countries in Europe. And then also Professor Hossein is known for her research on politicized microfinance, which is the title of her award-winning book. And she also wrote a lot about Caribbean banker ladies, and she defines what that is. So the book is very comprehensive, and I hope you'll enjoy the presentations that you'll hear today, and also contact us if you have any questions.
Great, thank you, Sharon, and Sharon Austin, Professor Caroline Hossein. I would like only to say hello to Silvane Silva, who just joined us. Oi, Silvane.
Olá, tudo bem?
Hello, Silvane. You speak in Portuguese. This is a bilingual event. So before Silvane, I would like only to acknowledge the presence of this huge audience right now. We have like Senoritas Courier from Brazil. Clélia Rodriguez said this book is overdue, urgent, and a must across interdisciplinary teaching and learning spaces. Tatiana Hayes clap their hands. Michelle said, so excited to be here. What an amazing panel. I'm joining from the traditional, ancestral, and stolen lands of Musqueam, Squamish, and I don't know if I'm pronouncing correctly, Israeli what of people. And there are a lot of people saying hello, like Fabiana Benedito, Alceu Fernandes da Costa Neto, André Campos Rocha, Guilherme, the double Guilherme, actually. And there's a lot of people. Feel free to introduce yourselves, like the Han Martins Conceição from Federal University of Pará in Brazil, master in information science. So good to know. Now we will pass the ball to Professor Kevin Edmonds. As I already said, Kevin is assistant professor of Caribbean Studies at the University of Toronto, and Kevin is one of the editors of this book too, and has a strong research in the Caribbean. So, Kevin, can you speak a little bit about your work in Caribbean and your work for this book? Hello again.
Thank you for having me, Professor Groman. Just wanted to also thank Professor Hossein, Professor Austin, for letting me into this project to share my research and some of my insights that I found. So to speak about my case and my work in particular, I focused on two small Caribbean islands, St. Lucia and St. Vincent. Not too many people are familiar with them, probably outside of tourism. St. Vincent even less so. So when I say they're smaller than a lot of cities. St. Lucia is 180,000 people. St. Vincent is just a hair over 100,000 people. So these are two countries which majority population is of African descent. They were primarily, as all the places in the Caribbean, initially agricultural economies. And we saw that change in the mid-1990s when the World Trade Organization, backed or pushed by the United States, basically wanted to advance this free market fundamentalism across the region and get rid of what was called protected trade in the Caribbean. So St. Lucia and St. Vincent, they were able to grow and sell bananas to Europe, primarily to England, at a above market rate. This was beneficial for England, but also for these countries in the Caribbean. It also extended to countries on the African continent as well as Pacific Islands. So it was kind of this overhang of colonial trade relations, which in some ways had a lot of issues kind of keeping the economies like monocrop, but it provided a floor for a lot of the people. My grandfather, he was a banana farmer. All my uncles, they were banana farmers. It's all in the past tense. Because that economy was destroyed in the mid-1990s, like I said. So almost overnight. I mean, it was a slower implosion, but you had, in the case of St. Lucia, close to 50% of the working population that it was either directly or indirectly involved in bananas lost their immediate line of work. So people had to scramble to put different occupations together. So a lot of people cobbled together part-time jobs, informal work, but there wasn't enough for people. So a lot from my work and knowing my family and what they had to go through, we immigrated. That's one of the reasons why a lot of my family is not in St. Lucia anymore, is because of what happened, because of the economic conditions. And that's the same for a lot of people, where the diasporas of these Caribbean countries are actually larger, sometimes several times over than the population that remains. So seeing that, I was interested initially in the banana trade and what happened, but after that, I did my master's on that. I was looking at kind of where a lot of the young people and a lot of the farmers transitioned to, because that market wasn't there anymore, and they didn't get jobs in the service sector. They weren't working in the banks or the hotels or doing things like that. And it was that a lot of people ended up going into the hills and started cultivating cannabis. So ganja is another name, like local name, that we would call marijuana. And that kind of really opened the door to show me that there was this kind of alternative economy that existed in St. Lucia that was providing, and in St. Vincent, that was providing people with a safety net that wasn't necessarily visible to people that studied the formal economy. So this was, when I say it was everywhere, it kind of was. It was like a public secret. People knew you had family, or you were engaged in it in somehow, or you knew someone that was. But people were just finding a way to make do. And it wasn't that people were becoming incredibly wealthy. This was for people to meet their basic needs. I mean, at best, people had moderate social mobility upward. But the goal was for people to try and find a foothold where they could often transition into the formal economy. So they would go and cultivate their crops up in the hills and land that wasn't suitable for traditional agricultural purposes. And they would often work together as teams. So this is where the cooperative economics came in, is that in St. Lucia, there's a tradition of Combi, which is St. Lucian Creole, which is about traditional cooperative labor practices and exchange. So it's often related to agriculture. So people tilling land, harvesting crops, but also putting up houses and things like that. So when it's big efforts, people come together and they share. When it's your turn, you know, you'll get the help from your neighbors, your community, your family in that sense. And this is what happened in terms of what was happening up in the hills, where you had smaller teams. Maybe it was 1 to 4 people, sometimes 6 people, that they were living up in the hills because of they had to secure the crop and make sure that it didn't get stolen, fertilize it, get access to equipment and inputs, that they would be on a rotating schedule, and they would also just all share in the profits. So this was the initial kind of model that I encountered. But it wasn't the only one, because we would see later on when I was doing my research that there was this competing model, which was more like sharecropping, where wealthy individuals would pay, poor people to grow the crop for them, and they would get a really raw deal. So when I mention about how this kind of cooperative economy works in St. Lucia and in St. Vincent in particular, it didn't just kind of exist on the margins. When I did some economic calculations to figure out the value of this in comparison. So St. Lucia is known as, like, the tourism is the #1 industry. Bananas was the green gold for the island for a long time, up until the mid 1990s. And cannabis actually surpasses both of those sectors combined. So it gives you an idea. And in St. Vincent, it surpasses that immensely, because they don't have a traditional tourism economy. I mean, they're starting to get into it now, and they were also more on the fringes in terms of agricultural production. So it had even much more of a foothold in St. Vincent than it did in St. Lucia. But I also saw from my research that people developed really sophisticated regional economies, bottom-up economies, where they were trading with each other across islands, and they were producing for something to be consumed locally, which is often not what we see in the Caribbean, that we're often importing and producing for export, that we don't have these kind of circular economies that are necessary for us to kind of capture what we would call the multiplier effect. And this social economy, even though it was illicit and informal and underground, met a lot of people's basic needs. And it was done in a more, when we talk about the drug trade, we tend to conflate it with crime. It was actually very, very stable. There were occasions where people would, yes, have disputes about, point of sale and stuff like that, occasional robberies, but it wasn't like the cocaine trade. It wasn't gang, orchestrated. There wasn't a lot of the violent crime that we would see maybe in the cities, where the gangs are operating, breaking in, or kidnapping, those kinds of things. So it points to what's possible if people are given the opportunity, or even when they're not given the opportunity, actually, to make things work for themselves. So just happy to put that out there and hear what others have to say as well. So thank you for having me.
Great. Thank you so much, Professor Kevin Edmonds. Now we will turn the language into Portuguese. I'm Brazilian too, and I'm trying to summarize a little bit in 1 minute Silvane's talk in Portuguese. I apologize if you don't speak Portuguese-ish, but maybe this is an opportunity for you to listen this beautiful language. I will introduce Silvane in English, and after she will speak in Portuguese. Silvane Silva is a consultant at the project Racial Relations at Ação Educativa, Educative Action in São Paulo City. She has a PhD in social history from Catholic University of São Paulo. She's a researcher at Center of African and Diaspora Cultural Studies, and also a member of study group on education at Education College of University of São Paulo. Silvane, feel free to introduce properly yourself in Portuguese. I will turn my language now, so you have the opportunity to listen this amazing language. Silvane Silva é consultora em Relações Sociais na Ação Educativa em São Paulo, tem doutorado em História Social pela PUC de São Paulo, pesquisadora do Centro de Estudos da Diaspora, de Estudos Africanos e da Diaspora Africana também na PUC, e integrante do Grupo de Estudos em Educação na Faculdade de Educação da USP. E fique livre, Silvane, para se apresentar propriamente. Além disso, a Silvane também, para esse livro, escreveu um capítulo sobre quilombolas no estado de São Paulo. O nome do capítulo é Fighting to Preserve Black Life and Land Rights, a Study of Quilombolas in the State of São Paulo, Brasil. Silvane, muito obrigado por ter a gente aqui. Fique livre para apresentar teu capítulo e as tuas ideias. Boa tarde.
Olá, boa tarde. Agradeço aí o convite feito para compartilhar as ideias com vocês. Vou, então, falar em português, né? E contar um pouquinho sobre como eu chego, né, nessa pesquisa sobre as mulheres quilombolas, que são lideranças nas comunidades aqui no estado de São Paulo. Então, começo agradecendo aí a professora Caroline, a professora Sharon e todos os participantes desse painel. A minha pesquisa, ela se inicia com a educação, né, escolar quilombola, mas com um olhar voltado, então, para como essas comunidades, que são comunidades remanescentes, né, do período de escravização, mas também comunidades que vão se reconfigurando, vão se reformulando ao longo da história aqui no Brasil, e que hoje elas permanecem, né, em número bastante grande. No recente censo, nós tivemos aí confirmadas, né, a existência de mais de 6.000 comunidades quilombolas aqui no Brasil. Então, esse recorte que eu faço para participar desse livro é das comunidades aqui do estado de São Paulo, e com foco, então, em como as mulheres, principalmente as mulheres, né, são lideranças nessas comunidades, elas se organizam para a manutenção dos seus modos de vida. Então, nós temos aqui no estado de São Paulo um grande número de comunidades no Vale do Ribeira, chamado Vale do Ribeira, né? Quem teve acesso aí ao capítulo vai ter uma compreensão maior de onde se localiza o Vale do Ribeira, né? Que a gente tem algumas imagens aí no capítulo, mas é onde estão o maior número das comunidades aqui em São Paulo, mas também temos comunidades no litoral norte. E a pesquisa é feita com essas mulheres que se organizam para a manutenção dos seus modos de vida, e aí elas têm diferentes modos de organização nas suas comunidades, visando garantir, em primeiro momento, né, o principal, que é a posse da terra, a conquista da titulação dos seus territórios, para que elas possam continuar se desenvolvendo economicamente nos seus territórios, como elas já vêm se organizando, né, ao longo de muitos anos, inclusive algumas comunidades ao longo de séculos, né? Nós temos comunidades aqui com mais de 3 séculos de existência. Então, essa luta, né, o título do capítulo, que é a luta, né, pela preservação dos modos de vida, dos direitos, né, à terra, ela passa, então, por essa trajetória dessas mulheres que se organizam coletivamente para garantir para suas famílias e automaticamente para toda a sua comunidade a permanência nessa terra, que existe uma disputa muito grande ainda pela posse da terra. Nem todas as comunidades, na verdade, a minoria delas conseguiram a titulação, né? Então, num primeiro momento, a luta é para a permanência. E aí algumas comunidades, elas vão se organizar por meio da agricultura, aquelas que ainda conseguiram preservar uma grande porção, né, de terras em que é possível fazer agricultura orgânica, familiar, e aí a venda desses produtos, né? Então, outras comunidades que estão, principalmente as do litoral norte, localizadas num espaço onde é possível também fazer um turismo, atividades de turismo, para que a juventude, né, quilombola, que permanece ainda nas suas comunidades, possam desenvolver atividades de turismo étnico. Então, são atividades que essas mulheres organizam nas suas comunidades, com o intuito de fazer com que as famílias possam permanecer e tirar, né, o próprio sustento dessa terra. E aí, como elas mesmas falam, né, a luta pela terra e a permanência pela terra, ela está vinculada ao desenvolvimento da economia para a sustentabilidade, né, das pessoas nesse território, mas ela também tem muito a ver com a sustentabilidade dos modos de vida daquela população que ali está. Então, a própria cultura quilombola, né, o modo de cultivar a terra, as danças, as crenças, a religiosidade, tudo isso é o que faz manter as famílias ainda nesses territórios, muito embora ainda sem titulação uma grande parte. E um outro ponto, né, de destaque que eu faço aqui para a gente conversar é que nessas comunidades a gente percebe que existe dois conceitos, né, que estão presentes nesse trabalho realizado por essas mulheres e nesse modo como essas mulheres se organizam e se posicionam na vida, que são os conceitos do bem viver, né, que a gente consegue observar na maneira de vida e de organização dessas mulheres, e também um conceito de bem viver, que é um conceito, né, dos indígenas andinos, mas também o conceito que é um conceito zulu, né, que é da Ubuntu, né, que é como é que eu consigo pensar que eu só sou uma pessoa através de outra pessoa, né? Então, nas comunidades quilombolas, a gente escuta muito dizer que não existe o eu, existe o nós. Então, considerando que essas formas de organização, essas formas de manutenção da vida nas comunidades quilombolas, elas automaticamente passam pela preocupação com o coletivo. E aí, nesse sentido, a gente observa que essa trajetória, né, das comunidades quilombolas aqui no Brasil, essa forma econômica de organização e de manutenção da terra, seja na produção dos alimentos orgânicos, a terra é, para além de algo que se vai produzir o alimento, esse alimento ele vai nutrir não só o corpo, mas também vai nutrir a alma, porque nesse conceito do Ubuntu e do bem viver, é considerado que aquilo que eu utilizo, né, o espaço que eu utilizo coletivamente e para a manutenção do meu grupo, essa forma de vida, ela automaticamente vai garantir também a preservação da natureza que ali está. Então, essa relação também com a sustentabilidade, com o meio em que essas comunidades se localizam. Tanto é que hoje, quando a gente olha para o mapa do estado de São Paulo, onde existe ainda a presença de mata, né, atlântica, preservada, onde não foi destruída, onde a urbanização não tomou conta, é justamente a urbanização predatória, né, não tomou conta, é justamente nesses espaços aonde estão localizadas as comunidades quilombolas e também as comunidades indígenas, especialmente na região do Vale do Ribeira e na região do litoral norte. Então, eu acho que nesse capítulo, né, em que eu apresento aqui essas formas organizativas das mulheres quilombolas no estado de São Paulo, tem esse sentido de contar um pouco, né, como é que essas mulheres podem garantir não somente para elas e para suas famílias, mas para todos nós, né, para toda a população brasileira, que a gente tenha ainda garantido formas de vida que nos permitam existir de uma maneira mais digna, mais humana e mais respeitosa também perante a natureza. Então, é uma produção econômica que pensa na manutenção também da natureza, da sociedade e sempre na contribuição coletiva, né? Existe sempre o nós, não somente o eu. Então, acho que esse é um resumo rápido do capítulo e para a gente abrir a nossa conversa aqui de hoje. Então, eu agradeço também a audiência de vocês. Obrigada.
Muito obrigado, Silvane, por sua excelente apresentação. For those who doesn't speak Portuguese, I tried to summarize a little bit the Silvane's talk through the chat. So just to summarize some of the points, I'd like to summarize that Silvane highlighted the long history of struggle and organizing for more than 1 century, 2 centuries, sometimes in relation to land and ownership, especially by Quilombola women. And they are women organizing themselves and struggling, fighting for permanence on the land for themselves and their family. Nowadays, there are young Quilombolas currently developing ethnic tourism activities in order to their families can stay on those lands and earning their own or on earnings there. In these communities, there are two concepts that are present in the labor conducted by these women in the way they organize themselves. The first concept is a good living, or in Spanish, buen vivir, and the Zulu concept of Ubuntu, in order to address that I'm only a person because of the other person. So there's no an I, but there's only us. And this means a strong commitment with the collective body. And so in this chapter about Quilombola women in the state of São Paulo, Silvane Silva talked about how women can guarantee more human ways of life that are respectful of nature and with this collective organized, not just for their families, but for the entire Brazilian population. I would just add a short commentary here. I'm more like a research on labor and technology. There's some African scholars now trying to understand this Ubuntu aspect in order to create alternative forms of AI, of artificial intelligence, considering Ubuntu philosophy. But after I can talk more about that. Thank you, Silvane. Now I will pass the ball to the professor Salewa Olawoye. Salewa, as I told you before, is assistant professor in the Business and Society program in the Department of Social Science at York University here in Toronto. And Salewa wrote a chapter called Beyond Coping, the use of agile culture among Nigerian immigrants to counter racial capitalism in North America. So good afternoon for you, Salewa, and can you speak a little bit about your chapter in this book? Thank you for having us.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Rafa. Again, my name is Salewa, and thank you very much, Professor Austin, Professor Hossein, Professor Edmonds, for bringing me on this project. So my chapter had to do with the use of the agile culture, and what agile is really is it's a Rosca. It's native to the southwestern part of Nigeria, and so it's the use of repeating that culture or continuing that culture in the diaspora. That's what I was interested in. I wanted to my research was about understanding why people would replicate the adjust system in North America with the kind of advancement or development that happens here? Why would people still need that? And so with that in mind, I started my research on people that I had, people that currently run an adjust system. People that run it in Canada, people that run it in the US. And I wanted to understand what was going on in their minds to, in a system where we say, oh, well, when you travel, there's a credit system. This is how it works. And so you don't need to run this system. But why do people still feel the need to run the adjust system? And one of the things that I had encountered was the concept of racial capitalism that existed in North America that these Nigerian immigrants faced, that made them to go back to the old system that they were used to. For example, if a person came in newly to Canada, one of the things, or to the US, one of the things they would not have is a credit history. And usually you cannot do much without a credit history, even renting a place and things like that. And so the people who would come in, whatever class they come in with, whether as skilled workers, whatever they come in with, they would come into these countries, and they would be faced with obstacles. In Canada, for example, you're asked for a work history before, or like a Canadian experience before you get a job, things like that. And so these obstacles, how do they cross over these obstacles, and how do they use the adjust system to not just cross the obstacles, but to find a way of togetherness and build a community within this the North American setting? One of the things that I had found out is that the adjust was really for financial and non-financial integration. So for the new immigrant who would come into maybe Canada or the US for the first time, chances are they have no idea, or they don't know anyone in the land. And so when they get in, meeting people who generally look like them was a way of building a society. And so when they would come into these Nigerian communities, what the Ajo did was that it created a way of togetherness. It created a way of community. One of the things that you find is that when it comes to money, it can be a unifier. And so that's what that was. It created a community for these people. So for non-financial integration, people tend to know the people in their Rosca. They tend to know the people who are in their Ajo community. They tend to work together. They tend to introduce themselves to new ideas. For example, if someone approached me with a business idea that I didn't know anything about, and I belong to a Nigerian Ajo community, chances are I'm going to say, well, I don't know anything about this part of the arts, but I know someone who does. So that was the non-financial integration. Then the financial part of it was that people would come in, and for a system that was completely new to them, in the sense that a credit system, because the Nigerian system is not one where you have like credit cards and all that, so that are in use that way. And so for that system, some people would start in without a proper idea of how it works. And what they end up doing is that in some cases, people just completely avoid the use of a credit card or anything associated with credit like that. In that sense, they completely avoid it. In some other cases, people are forced to take it because they have to integrate into the society, but then they don't have a proper understanding of how to use it as new immigrants. And so they end up ruining their credit pretty early. So what the adjust system was for was it kind of helped with financial education and financial, it also provided financial benefits in terms of that new financial system. And how that would work is one of the first requirements for people who were going to join was they had to have a job. Sometimes if people didn't have a job, people around the community would help them with one. And so having that job helps them to save towards projects that push them to newer levels. So again, one great thing that I had noticed was that each stage of the immigrants' life in the new country, in the new home country, determined the level of ajo that they had worked with. So those who were new would usually start small. And so the idea of starting small is to just get into the system to fully understand it, so that they could build themselves up financially in a system that there were already systemic biases and hurdles against them. That was one. And then the other part was, as they got old, as they stayed longer in the country and built more of um, uh, uh, built their home more within the home country, they would, a lot of them would increase the kind of ajo that they did, whether it's the level of uh, um, biweekly contributions, or the level, or the number of ajo groups that they belong to. And this part, I try to understand why. And it just spoke to the fact that to develop more, a lot of them would trust the funds from their ajo community before they would trust the financial system, before they would trust getting a loan that would require a high interest rate because of racial, issues with racial capitalism. The interest rates that they were receiving wasn't the same rate that was going for the rest of the world, because hey, they didn't have a credit history when they came in. So all of that, the adjust system was used as a hurdle in this system. They didn't need to, another thing I realized, especially in the US, is they didn't need to belong in the same state. And they had also found a way to integrate this adjust system into the current financial system that they had, because now you have people who would use the Interact system for their contributions. They'll use Zelle, they'll use Cash App. And so that meant that you didn't really have to be in the same state. You could be in another state. The groups could be formed according to their um, occupation. It could be formed according to, even in terms of friendship, in some cases, religion. So people who belong to the same religion or religious houses, things like that. There was just the unifier that they used to form these groups and help each other grow. And like I said, giving each other opportunities that they would otherwise not have heard if they weren't in that Ajo group. And that was one of the major reasons why people were joining. One of them in Kansas City had told me how they called their own group the Investment Club. And the idea was that they pushed themselves to be better, so that every single time that one person receives their contribution, they're putting it towards an investment that would pay. Some of them were car dealers, some of them were restaurant owners, and they'll push it towards that business to help themselves get better. As a result, whenever they started a business, people in their community would also, in their job community, would also patronize each other. And so they just basically created a system where, despite the barriers that they had faced in the country, they were able to grow. They were able to invest more in themselves and invest in things that matter to them, that would give them higher returns. Just to round up, I wanted to also point out to the fact that one of the things that we had realized, or that I had realized in the course of this research for this chapter, was that people had heavily relied on the adjust system, not the loan system, not the credit system that was in existence, but they had heavily relied on the adjust system to do things that they thought really mattered to them. For example, in paying off, in putting down a down payment. And I know that, whenever they had to explain, how did you get this huge lump sum money? It becomes a case of, okay, this is from family and friends, because unfortunately the system would ask you, especially when you're just about to get a house, where did you get this lump sum money before you paid for the house? And so it would be explanation of family and friends, but really it was the adjust system that they were using to push themselves into home ownership, into into business ownership, and into general settling, despite the racial capitalism that was existing in the societies that they had now found themselves. So they had also pointed out that it was a great way for people who to help each other as a community. For example, it wasn't unheard of for people who belong to these adjust communities to say, even though I'm billed to take my own hand at the end of the year, but I have this project, and then people would willingly switch with them just because they were trying to help each other achieve their goals faster. If someone else who was really supposed to accept or receive their hand by the maybe early in the year, and they realized that they didn't need the money as desperately as the other person, they would happily switch. So they had created a community, they had created a system where it now became like a family. And so it was family that was created based on money, family that was created based on a common shared goal of togetherness and building a community in spite of a systemic racism that had existed in these communities. Um, so finally, um, my research had carried me into understanding how the members of these groups, these Ajo groups, this Ruska, the members of these Ruska had found a way to thrive in a system where a new system where they may not have if they had tried to do this alone. It's a thing of two heads are better than one, or the idea or the notion that no person is an island. Together they can move forward and move even farther than if one person had just tried to do it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. It's so good to listen you all. Before the Q&A, I'm asking people to ask your questions. I will just show some comments here. Clelia Rodriguez said, this is why trust as an indigenous teaching value is a crucial pillar in doing this work. Community building is built on trust. Thank you for this work. There are people congratulating on the book, on the talks, and with a lot of claps. Yes, there's a lot of claps and like very important topic in this. So good. Before the Q&A, I would like only to 1 second. Yeah. I would like to ask Professor Caroline Hossein and Professor Sharon Austin, in order to start the discussion, some like so easy questions for you. Why solidarity economies in plural, or why Black solidarity economies matters, and one another so easy question for you is what beyond racial capitalism means, because we are still living in racial capitalism, but we have, as all of you said, a long history of struggle and how to like prefigure or envision other futures living in the current system we are living in. So the floor is yours to to respond in like 1 minute, 2 minutes, 3 minutes. This so easy questions.
Okay, I can just go first. I want to address the first question a little bit of why solidarity economies matters, because I think this research is really important simply because I grew up in the South. I grew up in Tennessee and Memphis, and my parents were from Mississippi. And my parents and the people in the community were practicing solidarity economics, but they didn't know it. It didn't have a name or a title. You just knew that there was a strong sense of community and that people relied on each other and helped each other for their own financial benefit. And it was their way of responding to the kind of racial discrimination that they dealt with. My parents grew up in the Mississippi Delta, and in the chapter in one of the chapters that I wrote, I write about Fannie Lou Hamer and the Freedom Farm Collective, and just the fact that back in the 60s, even people were practicing solidarity economics in Mississippi, but it didn't really have a name or a concept. So that's why solidarity economics matters, because it's a way for people not only to benefit financially, but it also is a way for people to have a sense of community. And to echo some of the things that have been said today, especially for immigrants who are arriving in new countries where they're sometimes, where they're usually greeted with a lot of hostility, this is their way of not only helping each other to settle in and to financially, but it also is their way of building a sense of community. and also helping people to have more self-pride and know that they don't have to be so reliant on a system that's oftentimes hostile and discriminatory against them.
Great. Thank you, Sharon Austin. Professor Caroline Hossein.
Yeah, so I think that Sharon answered pretty well the Black social economy. Please check out Sharon's chapter on the US case because it's important to see how what marginal lives look like. I'm glad that Professor Olawoye was able to speak to Nigerian immigrant experience and how a Joe is a lifeline for people to access credit, get on with livelihoods, and what have you. So the Black solidarity or the Black social economy is really an emerging area of study. It really does push up against mainstream understandings of what another world looks like, what alternatives are, in quotations, alternatives, because as a people, as Jessica Gordon-Nembhard, who the author of Collective Courage, has written and who we draw on and cite on, has spoken about this idea that we've always been doing this kind of solidarity economics. I mean, Sharon just gave a testimonial of growing up in the South in the US, and these solidarity economies for a long time have not been named, but the pooling and the sharing of knowledge and goods has always been a part of the treasure trove of who people of African descent, particularly the diaspora, and who we are. And so that kind of speaks to your second question, Professor Groman, this idea of why going beyond. And I think in our forward, Professor Tiffany Willoughby Herrard really does underline our intention with this idea of to go beyond racial capitalism, right? This idea of racial capitalism, it surrounds us. It can consume us, right? It sometimes makes that almost always the starting point of us defining who we are. And as I've learned from so many of my colleagues, namely, Seeds for Change, Dr. Rodriguez, has always said, why must we let this idea, this colonial project and the colonial library continually define who we are as a people? We are beyond that, and we need to think about going beyond racial capitalism like we've always done for these kinds of innovative solutions. And so what we accept, there are traumas, there are exclusion, business exclusion, all kinds of pains related to that racial bias, the social force and the tiering of social forces for the benefit of fundamentalist type of capitalist extraction. We get that. But we also know that so much of who we are is not being described as a special victims unit, right? It's about who we are to stand up, care for community, build new ways of doing things that not only are an expression of Blackness and African identities of who we are, often living as a minority, particularly in the West, but also where do we take this and how do we help the world that is clearly in suffering mode, right? And so that's what we mean by going beyond. We take that actually going beyond is actually comes from a scholar who wrote the story about Cedric Robinson, Josh, Sharon, I'm missing his name, Josh Myers, I believe. Josh Myers, I think he might be at Howard University, and he's written a book on Cedric Robinson. And part of it was how Cedric's work was, how do we go beyond only defining ourselves according to the harm and the traumas we face, and how do we look to acts of rebellion, acts of camaraderie and cooperation as a way to do something different, right? To sort of be a force in the world for goodness. And I think that's all I wanted to say on that. Thanks.
Great, thank you. There's a lot of question Maybe there is a problem with Silvane image. It's like an 80s image of, but like maybe you can try to stop and but it's interesting, the aesthetics too. We have two questions here in the chat. The first one is from Tatiani Hayes. The question is, I was wondering if panelists could talk a little bit if and how the pandemic has reshaped the dynamics discussed in the chapters, or em português, gostaria de saber se os integrantes da mesa poderiam falar se e como a pandemia reestruturou as dinâmicas abordadas em seus capítulos. Who want to go first? Maybe Kevin? Do you have any response to how pandemic changed the dynamics of your work? Yeah, you can talk first, Salewa.
Sorry, thank you. The reason why I'm going first was because there was a part of my chapter that I didn't speak on, which is the fact that the research happened or continued during the pandemic. And so I had started before the pandemic, and then COVID happened, and then I had to pause, and then the rest of my research was electronic because of COVID. And one of the things that I really wanted to find out was how the pandemic had affected the adjust systems that were in place. And unfortunately, some members of communities had lost their jobs. And so, what did that mean for the groups? What did that mean for the system? A great thing was that because a lot of them and a lot of the emphasis was on building, like rebuilding, it didn't mean that losing their job meant that they had lost everything. Some people had businesses that they quickly had positions that they filled in with the members of the group that had lost their jobs. So it further strengthened their community. And for those who had lost their jobs and didn't quickly speak up, what had happened, and one of the things that I had found was the need to find like a replacement just so that the community continues. And in that situation, there were people who, because they were working remotely, were willing to do that. So it did not. It didn't kill or it didn't stop the community, the social community, and the view towards money and investment that had already been built. It actually further strengthened it because people had found themselves again. You're locked at home in a lockdown, no family, no friends, but then you had this community that you could rely on. Meetings were being had in that period that had further strengthened their community. So, one of the things that, again, the reason why I'm speaking is what the pandemic did. Uh, I thought it would have broken things down, but it actually further strengthened the groups that had already been formed. Um, Going forward, now that people know this is a thing, when they're forming the community, it makes them understand that, well, if a pandemic comes, I have a family that I have created through a mutual drive for building ourselves in this society using the money and a job. And so this family is here for me regardless. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Sharon?
I was pretty much going to say the same thing. So that really was a very good summary. I would say that COVID made it harder for some of us to do research because it made it so that, luckily for me, I was on research leave that year, but my university, like others, closed down and everyone had to transition online. So that meant that at the time I have two children, one of which is special needs. And I had both of my children at home. And so for parents who had kids at home, if you know anything about kids, you can't get anything done. Even though my kids were teenagers at the time, it still was hard. So it was difficult for those of us who were doing research at the time. But as far as the impact of COVID on the people working in these types of cooperatives, I think it built even more solidarity in the sense that they saw that this was something that none of us could have predicted. This was something like, I guess you could argue, a once in a lifetime international pandemic, but it could happen again. Let's hope that it never will. But no one ever would have thought that in countries around the world that everything would have shut down. People would have lost their jobs. People would not have been able to leave their house to go to work or anywhere else. And so that made it show people in communities that they needed to have something else there. They needed to have some type of opportunity to work, to network and build solidarity with the other people who lived in their community in case they ever need anything, or in case they ever wanted to help anyone else. So COVID really had an impact in the sense that it really, I guess, sort of helped to build a sense of community rather than hurt the community.
Amazing. Thank you. Kevin, do you want to add some words to that? And after I will ask a question directly to Silvane.
My work, to be honest, I wasn't conducting research. My work was prior to COVID. The communities that and people that I was connected with, I stayed in contact with them throughout the pandemic. I'm still in contact with them. The biggest thing would obviously be in the Caribbean, we tend to, their dependency on like foreign tourism is huge. So a lot of the people that did have those stable jobs, they found themselves totally out of work because there were no airlines flying into these countries. So there was like added pressure. But one of the issues that people were telling me is that the market has also gone down because you don't have tourists coming in to sell to. So like economically it impacted them, but they were trying to find ways to actually mitigate the harm that was happening, you know, the increased poverty and unemployment, and something that was actually positive that could come out, if it's going to spin it like that, is that people actually went back to the land, and that whereas people that had never really been in farming or transitioned out of it because, you know, they thought it's this kind of old generation thing that's not working for them, and they're moving up, so they're going to leave it behind. A lot of them went back and they actually started doing like kitchen gardens and setting up networks where, you know, if your land is good for growing what would they call dasheen, like a yam, sweet potato, but you have a breadfruit tree, that they would trade with each other so that they would be able to get enough to eat, and then also like save money to take care of other needs. So in that sense, it wasn't necessarily connected to cannabis, but people ended up reviving a lot of these networks that were in place before to manage issues of food insecurity and unemployment that really hit the region.
Great, thank you so much. Now we have a question directly to Silvane from André Campos Rocha. What are the main challenges Quilombola communities face in trying to thrive and live with their own resources in Brazil? Em português, Silvane, quais são os maiores desafios que as comunidades quilombolas encontram em suas tentativas de prosperar em viver com seus próprios recursos?
Obrigada, André, pela pergunta. Como eu falei anteriormente, um dos maiores entraves para que as comunidades quilombolas possam viver de acordo com os seus modos, né, de vida é, de fato, fazer com que o governo brasileiro titule essas terras, né? Deem às comunidades quilombolas aquilo que lhe é de direito, que é a posse da terra. Porque antes da comunidade quilombola possuir o título da terra, eles conseguem desenvolver as atividades, né, econômicas de desenvolvimento, mas estão sempre passando por momentos de conflitos, né, de interesses, com grandes empresários, com empreiteiros, com os grandes latifundiários, pessoas que querem fazer resorts naqueles locais onde está preservado a natureza, né? Então, o principal conflito e o entrave, né, para que as comunidades possam, de fato, continuar a fazer a manutenção dos seus modos de vida, é conseguir a titulação da terra. A partir daí, aquelas comunidades que já obtiveram o título e que já podem, de alguma maneira, se tranquilizar nesse sentido, seriam os apoios, né, no sentido de garantia de que a sua produção ela possa ter um escoamento para as demais regiões, que ela possa ter garantido também não é só o título da terra, né? Mas que a partir do momento que a comunidade tem a titulação da terra, ela possa também ter no seu interior outros aparatos como a saúde, educação, né? Então, de fato, ter uma escola quilombola que funcione com professores quilombolas, e aí a gente tem um ponto primordial, né? Que foi as diretrizes nacionais para a educação escolar quilombola, publicada no ano de 2012, que diz lá da obrigatoriedade, né, de existir dentro das comunidades quilombolas, escolas e com formação específica, calendário específico, currículo específico, para que essas crianças, adolescentes possam permanecer estudando no interior da sua própria comunidade, porque a maioria não tem escola, então eles precisam sair para estudar fora, nas escolas da cidade, e aí um currículo diferente das escolas que não se apropriam da história dessas comunidades, muitas vezes fazem com que as crianças e os adolescentes também cresçam tendo um olhar, muitas vezes até negativo para a sua própria comunidade, né? A partir daquilo que é dito na escola, que não tem essa preocupação. Então, eu acho que a gente tem aí como principal entrave para a manutenção é a titulação da terra, e a partir da titulação da terra, a garantia de demais direitos, como principalmente o acesso à saúde e à educação, para que essas comunidades possam, de fato, desenvolver o seu trabalho e ter uma continuidade dos seus modos de vida.
Obrigado, Silvane. Eu vou tentar traduzir ou sintetizar um pouco tua fala em inglês. One of the biggest obstacles is getting the Brazilian government to give the titling or the ownership of the land. There are a series of conflicts with large landowners, business people who want to create resorts and so on. And after, for the communities who already have land ownership and titling, they need support in order to the production and go to different regions, and also other issues are having health and education, especially in the case of education, having Quilombola schools with Quilombola professors, with all this Quilombola educational systems. We have another question. So thank you, Silvani. We have another question from undergrad student from University of Toronto, Scarborough, Shyla Brooks. Shyla Brooks loves the empowerment we give ourselves through community behind the scenes. And she wants to ask all the fantastic professors, how can we engage the next generation in these ideas? And this is interesting because I am researching, working with cooperatives in the delivery sector in Brazil, especially one is here, Senoritas Courier, a collective of women and trans people who do delivery in São Paulo. And sometimes I felt that, especially like younger generations, but especially like women or black people or black women, some of these people, they don't know this long history of struggles. So maybe the question is how to connect those things. So feel free, who want to start.
I can start. I think that one of the ways to sort of connect the younger generation is by doing what we're doing now, by having different opportunities to talk about our research and just talk about. I like to connect the history to the present.
Yeah, you are here.
Oh, okay. Can you hear me? Okay, I can tell. I like to connect the history to the present in all of my classes. And so I like to always tell my students about this one quote that I want to point out from an activist by the name of Fannie Lou Hamer. She was very involved in Mississippi civil rights. She died in 1977 at the age of 59. And she fought for voting rights. And she also had something called the Freedom Farm Collective, which was, I guess, it wasn't one of the earliest co-ops, but it was during the height of the civil rights movement in the 1960s when finally African Americans were getting civil rights and voting rights, but yet they were poor. They had no economic rights, and they had to deal with a lot of remaining obvious economic discrimination. So she talked about solidarity economics back then and talked about the need to engage in cooperatives. And this is what she said. Guess what? We can't win the political struggle until we have economic independence. And how can we have economic independence? We have to own our own land, control our own food production, and we have to do it through co-ops. So I would like to talk about her work in the 1960s and sort of related to some of the things even that I mentioned in my chapter about the different solidarity economic efforts that are going on today, because she had a lot of influence on them. She may not even have known it at the time, but I sort of relate the past to the present. So to answer the student's question, the way to involve the younger generation is really, I think that student is really doing a lot, even by coming to participate in something like this and to want to learn about this. And I try to include this type of information in my classes as well. And then also this fall, we'll be having something at the University of Florida. We have a lot of students from different countries at UF that don't know anything about this. That's one of the things I want to do is have a book talk and to highlight some of the work that we're doing so that they will understand what's going on in other countries, and so that they can understand also that this is something that maybe they may not know it, but their parents or grandparents probably were involved in some type of solidarity economic effort. So hopefully that answers her question.
Great, thank you. Yeah.
So I would like to thank the student from University of Toronto Scarborough for coming. I want to say it out there with Professor Rafa and Professor Kevin that we're all three of us are at the University of Toronto. So like Sharon said, you just coming online and being here is a huge step in trying to build into the consciousness this concept of membership institutions. We're teaching our students why development is poor, and there's lots of reasons why it's problematic and extractive. But what about if we think about how people can take charge of their own destinies, right? Like, how do people contribute to sustainable livelihoods? There's all kinds of it. Like, philanthropy has been so problematic. NGOs are colonizing. So what about membership cooperative institutions? They're not void of issues either, but maybe because we have a history of doing this, we can also be sort of leading the way in terms of how we do development. And we definitely need youth voices in this conversation. So just one practical thing to get you started for the students who are here from anywhere is that I have, through a Canada Research Chair, a podcast called Diverse Economies. And I can't put links in this chat, but someone will find it. I'm sure Tatiana or Kate will find it. And it's called Diverse Economies Podcast. It's for youth, and a youth runs it out of the University of Toronto. And she speaks to scholars like Sharon and like Silvane and others who are thinking about cooperation, economic cooperation, and how that makes sense for young people. Thank you so much, Rafa, for finding that. And so that's one sure way. If you have ideas for events that are student-led, that you want to speak about cooperation, because our university likes to think about things individualized. Rafa is at the university. Kevin Edmonds is at the university. I'm there. Contact your student union. We would love to support and get behind those kinds of projects, particularly at the undergraduate level. Thanks.
Great, thank you. Silvane?
Eu penso que uma das maneiras, né, possíveis da gente conseguir fazer com que as novas gerações elas possam compreender essas formas organizativas que sempre foram feitas, né, pelas populações africanas e populações indígenas aqui no Brasil, uma das melhores e principais e impossível, né, a gente conseguir fazer com que as novas gerações conheçam isso sem passar pelo processo educativo. E aí, nesse sentido, aqui no Brasil, a gente teve a publicação, né, de legislações específicas da educação, e eu, como educadora que sou, não poderia deixar de falar disso, que são as legislações que falam sobre a obrigatoriedade do ensino da temática da história africana, afro-brasileira e indígena nas escolas da educação básica, para a gente perceber o quão absurdo é, né, esse processo do capitalismo, da colonização, que faz com que a gente deixe de aprender a nossa própria história, né, a nossa própria história, e aí a gente percebe que a juventude, crianças, jovens, estão aprendendo muito mais o que acontece em outros lugares do que dentro do próprio país. Ou quando a gente fala em economia, né, quando a gente está falando das cooperativas, como a professora Caroline traz, a gente tem nas nossas escolas uma preocupação com a educação financeira, uma venda, né, vamos dizer aí, de uma ideia de empreendedorismo para a juventude, e que é totalmente desvinculada daquilo que é feita pelas populações indígenas e quilombolas, né? Então, eu acho que um dos pontos que a gente precisa urgentemente garantir aqui no Brasil é que, de fato, esse conteúdo das formas de organização e de vida das comunidades indígenas e quilombolas sejam incorporadas, e da população negra em geral, né, seja incorporada pelas crianças, adolescentes, jovens que estão nas zonas urbanas, né? E a escola tem esse papel de fazer isso e não faz, né? Então, eu acho que esse é um ponto de destaque que eu trago para essa conversa sobre como é que a gente liga as gerações, né? Eu acho que a gente precisa primeiro conhecer a própria história. Então, aí a gente está falando de descolonizar pensamento mesmo, né? Ou contra-colonizar, como diria um pensador nosso aqui, o Antônio Bispo.
Great. Muito obrigado, Silvane. Eu estava terminando de escrever Decolonizing Knowledge and Thought. I will try to summarize, especially one of the ways is legislation regarding the mandatory teaching of African indigenous history in schools, which is an instrument for us to really learn about our own history, because sometimes we know more about European history than especially like the Brazilian history in that way. And I will add from myself, Rafael, the work Silvani is conducting on anti-racist education. So this is so important. And the other thing, especially regarding economy, Silvani is highlighting how the current dominant discourses on financial education from an entrepreneurialism discourse is far from the concerns, or disconnected from the concerns and ways of life of the majority of the population, especially indigenous and Quilombola communities. And she highlights the importance to decolonize thoughts, or decolonizing knowledge, or counter-colonizing knowledge and thoughts, according to Antonio Bispo. So thank you so much. I think this is so good. We are approaching the end of our event. I would like to invite all of you to do your closing remarks, or even if you like to advertise your own work. And I really like the comment by Clélia Rodriguez on stay hydrated and like drink water and like other kinds of juice. And so important too. So feel free to do your final remarks there.
I can go first. First of all, want to just say thank you to Oxford University Press and our editor, Adam Swallow, for giving us the opportunity. Professor Hossein mentioned this at the very beginning. A lot of people don't like to hear about things like racial capitalism. These are even some theories that are being banned in some states. And so that's why what we're doing is not only educational, but it's very brave work to write about the truth about race and racism, because now there is such a backlash against this type of work. So thank you to Adam. Thank you to all of the contributors to the chapters who are able to work on this. And thank you all for coming today. And this is this is the book. So I hope you all will enjoy reading it.
Great, thank you. More would like to do your closing remarks, say like your amazing work you are doing, the next book, the next like research, or your email or your website. Yeah, Kevin, go ahead.
I don't have any exciting stuff like that. I just started my job, so I'm turning the dissertation into a book, hopefully in the near future. But yeah, what we're doing is actually in the community. A bunch of us have got together to, like, it's not a mutual aid / cooperative like learning opportunity that we all pitched together to fund a political education organization. So that's the Caribbean Solidarity Network. We have a community study circle that meets once a month, where we dive into things like this. This would be one of the topics, actually, to go back to what was said before about this history that exists. Might have been our parents, it might have been our grandparents, but this is not stuff that's like separate from us. But often we grow up not knowing it. And in a way to connect with these ideas and say that they're not foreign, they're not what other people do. This is what we do. This is what we've done. And that what we'll continue to do till we get to a place where we don't have to do this anymore. So there's that. And no, it's just been a pleasure. Thank you for inviting us all on. I really appreciate it. And it's awesome to see so many people, attend, and the comments flowing. I need to practice Portuguese. I only know some bad words from growing up in Toronto with the my friends, where we would go. I won't say it, but you know some of them. But yeah, so no, it's cool to be in contact with like, for me, a different community that I don't often get to engage with. So I think that's amazing. So thank you, Professor Groman, for that, and everyone on the chat, and wishing everyone the best.
Thank you so much, Professor Kevin Edmonds. You have the opportunity to get to know the strong Brazilian community here in Toronto, and you speak a little bit of Portuguese. And yeah, you see, and maybe you can put on your tender file. That will be amazing. I will pass the ball to Salewa.
Thank you very much. I would go ahead and say, first of all, again, to the editors, thank you very much for bringing me up on this project. I think this is a particularly important project to talk about because, like has been rightly said, whenever things get to a topic on race, it's like a no-go area. It's like one of those, don't talk about religion, don't talk about politics. So race is one of those very touchy topics, and it's good to find out how things or these issues show up in North America. I currently teach two classes that used to be Professor Hussein's classes on business and social exclusion. And it's funny how these are topics we don't want to talk about. These are things we would rather avoid because they're not comfortable. They don't leave the audience, it leaves a sour taste in the mouth when you walk away from the topic, but they are important to highlight. We need to understand that racial capitalism is a thing, and there are people who struggle to try to get through it, and the ways that they handle it's and recognizing these ways, because I had said earlier how if someone had to put a down payment on the house, and at that time they were taking their adjourn, the bank will flag it as an issue, and then you now have to explain to the bank that this is money coming from family and friends and all of that stuff. So it's a very important topic that we need to have. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Caroline. Hossein.
Yes, so I have just a couple of disjointed comments to make. I want to first say thank you very much to Professor Groman and Digital Labor for all of the innovative work that they're doing and for having us be a part of this community. It has been a special day for us, and I was looking forward to it for weeks on end. So much gratitude to you and all of your students who are assisting in this project called Digital labor, and I urge you to look up Professor Groman. He's very active on socials, but he's very prolific scholar on worker platform, cooperative platforms. And that's the person you should be reading. So I would also like to say that, this book speaks back to the solidarity economy and the cooperative sector. We're very much a part of it, but there are also bias and cultural bias and racism acting within the cooperative sector. So this book actually fills in the gaps to progressives and people who support the cooperative sector to make them make space for other types of collective institutions that often work in the informal. And one of the contributors here in this book, and there are other people like Amina Mama and the late Tatiana Benjamin and business professor Adote Bing, who's starting Cooperative Africa, have also been a part of this project. Ibn Joseph of Ireland, a Nigerian scholar, sociologist based in Dublin, wrote, as Sharon mentioned, an excellent story on Black Irish, the Nigerians in Dublin. So there's so many great cases that go beyond what you heard today. But there was a practitioner who is executive director of the U.S. Federation for Workers, and his name is Esteban Kelly. And he did the afterword for us, and we wanted someone who is a practitioner who understands the struggles globally with cooperation. And I'll just leave you with a few lines of what he wrote, because I think it's a great way to summarize what we've been doing. Every cooperative and association, whether they are formal or not, is a site of practice, a space where everyday people are coming together to share power and to rebuild the commons, shining a light towards a greater understanding of cooperative economics is fundamental if we are to build a new world, one that is fair, one that is just, and one that is equitable. So that's the story. That's Beyond Racial Capitalism. It's been a pleasure being with you all here today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Caroline Hossein and Silvane, in Portuguese.
Bom, primeiro eu quero agradecer, né, a paciência de todos aí me ouvirem em português. Agradecer ao Rafael por estar fazendo aí esse sumário da fala. Agradecer a toda a audiência. Dizer que do fato de falarmos, né, aqui no Brasil sermos falantes de português, isso faz com que também nossas pesquisas, nossos trabalhos e tudo mais não tenha tanto acesso pela maioria das pessoas no mundo, que são aí falantes de outras línguas, mas nesse sentido agradeço demais a professora Caroline por ter, então, feito esse intercâmbio aqui com a gente, e aí agradeço também Tatiane Reis, que está aí na audiência, que foi quem nos colocou em contato aí, eu e Caroline. Agradeço a professora Sharon, Austin, né? Tivemos um contato aí no momento em que eu fui pesquisadora visitante lá na Universidade da Flórida, lá em 2018, com a professora Tânia Saunders. A gente teve um contato inicial naquele momento. Então, eu só tenho a agradecer por essa participação, porque eu acho que é muito importante para as nossas comunidades, né, quilombolas aqui no Brasil, ser conhecida por demais pessoas essa história, esse trabalho que é feito pelas mulheres quilombolas nas múltiplas comunidades que nós temos aqui, né? Esse recorte que eu fiz é um recorte muito pequeno das comunidades que estão localizadas aqui no estado de São Paulo e com as quais eu trabalhei, né, com as lideranças com as quais eu trabalhei, mas como eu disse anteriormente, a gente tem mais de 6.000 comunidades espalhadas no Brasil todo, né? Então, acho que é uma história, sim, para ser conhecida, para ser divulgada, e nesse sentido eu agradeço muito a professora Caroline, a Sharon, Kevin e todos os demais que estiveram presentes aqui e deram essa oportunidade também aqui de fala em português.
Thank you so much, Silvane. Silvane is thanking a lot of you and highlighting the importance to have this history in English and Portuguese, and everybody let know this experience. I would like to thank you so much, all of you. I learned so much today, and I'd like to invite all of you to the next book talk next Wednesday, same time. The book we will talk about next week is Algorithms of Resistance: The Everyday Fight Against Platform Power by Tiziano Bonini and Emiliano Torre, published by the MIT Press. So we are waiting for you next week again. Thank you so much, all of you. Good day for you. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you, Rafa.